Hello, welcome to this presentation of International Plumbing Code. My name is Thomas, and in this presentation we are going to go over Chapter 9. Now, there will be a series of presentations because there is so much in this chapter, and it is so important for a plumber to know that we're going to break this up a bit. But let me tell you what I sincerely believe, and that is that the difference between a plumber that knows what is going on and the one who doesn't is the plumber who knows venting. Think of this as tools in your tool bag. You have to know how to use them and to employ them. International Plumbing Code Chapter 9 gives us a variety of tools for venting, ways that we can vent our drainage pipe. But if you don't know how that works, if you don't know how to apply those tools, then you are at a disadvantage. And you're not as good of a plumber, let's just admit it. But that's okay, because that's why you're here, because you're going to learn what you need to know to be incredible. And I'm going to help you. Let's get into Chapter 9. Here we go into International Plumbing Code Chapter 9. Starting with 901, we have the scope. The scope in any of these chapters is going to tell us what this chapter is going to be all about. Let's just get a broad statement. What are we studying here? This chapter shall govern the materials, design, construction, and installation of vent systems. But this brings us to an important question. Why do we even need vents? Going back in time again, plumbing was experimental. You know what I mean? Like when they first developed pipes, that was an experiment. And they're like, oh, look, you can make a pipe out of this or that and then put something down it. Then they started hooking up fixtures to that, and that also was experimental. And it didn't take long for them to find that these fixtures don't flow very well into a pipe. And in fact, this was a big problem because over time, this was a major holdup for the progress of plumbing, for people to be able to accept it and to use it widely. Because, you'd hook up a fixture to a pipe, and then because of the pressures that build up inside of there, it would start to drain, but it would stop. You couldn't even get the fluids to go away, and then you've got this horrible mess right there in your living space. No good. So, legend has it that in New York City many years ago, the smart plumbers of the time, and we're talking in the 1800s, came together, the heads of the plumber union and associations at the time, trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And one person whose name escapes the records of history proposed an experiment and said, look, if you will let me run a 1-inch pipe off the top of our drains and out to the open air, I believe that our drains will then flow. And so they ran this experiment, and they found that it worked. They found that if you hook up an air pipe to a drain pipe, it flows. And all these problems with pressure down inside of there, it was solved. And venting enabled plumbing to spread and to be in our personal spaces. Oh, what a great history. And oh, how unfortunate that we don't know who actually came up with this and really employed it. Well, there you have the history. Obviously, why do we need vents? Because without that airflow inside of the system, fluids going down compresses the air that's inside of an empty drain, and that can actually stop the drain from flowing. Section 901.2 gives us a standard for the trap seal protection, stating that vent piping shall permit the admission or emission of air so that the seal of any fixture trap shall not be subject to a pressure differential more than 1-inch water column. What does that mean? That means we're going to hook up pipes to provide airflow. That means air can come in when it's needed if there's a negative pressure. It can push out if there's a positive pressure. And by doing so, we maintain the trap seal of the fixtures within 1 inch. Now this is a fluid. The fluids can move with pressures. Try this experiment sometime. Next time there's a big windstorm in your area, just go have a look at your toilet bowl. Open the lid, look at the water. If there's enough air pressure pounding on the pipes, the vents, out the roof, you'll actually see a fluctuation in the water level. It's kind of fun to watch. Now, so there's an example of the fact that all of our fixtures are trapped with a liquid, and all of those liquids are subject to pressure, and they can be removed. That trap seal can be lost. But the idea here is, even though knowing that there will be a difference in pressure, positive or negative, that fluid should not move more than 1 inch. That's the goal. We don't want it to suck down 2 inches. We don't want it to push back with back pressure 2 inches. We want it to stay there. Equilibrium is our goal. 901.3 talks about chemical waste vent systems, and we looked at chemical pipe back in chapter 7. The way that when you're dealing with certain chemicals, you may have to have an entirely separate system, first of all, that can handle those chemicals and not be destroyed by them. But also it must be entirely separate from the drainage, and that includes the vents. All vents would need to tie together with chemical pipe in that chemical drainage and vent system and be entirely independent of the sanitary system, because even the vapors, those chemical vapors, can be corrosive and they would cause problems on the venting of the sanitary system. And it would also need to terminate separately out the roof. 901.4 is kind of a catch-all. It just says use limitations. Basically, don't use the vent system for anything other than a vent system, whatever creative ideas may exist out there. 901.5 talks about tests, and once again refers us to chapter 3, saying anything on testing, go to 312. It's the same requirements as drainage. These vents are connected to that system. And 901.6 talks about engineered systems and how they would need to be approved. When it comes to materials, we don't need to redo that. We've already covered that in chapter 7. So they say 902, materials, just go look at 702, and you'll know all of the types of materials that you can use for above ground, for below ground, for whatever's necessary. It's the same stuff. 903.1, we look at roof extensions. And it says that this is to be determined by the local jurisdiction. So, the question of how far do you stub that vent up out the roof? People have different preferences and opinions. Different companies are going to do it to different lengths, but in reality, it is your local jurisdiction. And in Utah, the Utah Amendments has designated 12 inches is the amount that we bring a vent up through the roof, and you'd want to be conscious of that. Now, the other situation that may exist is if you're running a vent up out of a roof on a flat roof that may be used for a sun deck or some place to hang out, right? You're gonna go have a dinner party on the roof. That's fun. It provides a good view, but the last thing you would want as you're sitting at the table eating steak is to have sewer gas blowing in your face. So they say, let's create a 7-foot minimum. Get that pipe 7 foot up in the air. That way sewer gases are going to be up above, and hopefully they're not going to interfere as much. Personal opinion here, still wouldn't want to be too close to that if I'm having my steaks on the roof. Maybe there's other options. Maybe it could vent out the side, and we'll look at that in a minute. 903.1.3 talks about the protection of the vent terminal, and this is a new section added in the 2021 plumbing code. And what this is about is the increasing number of solar panels that are being installed on the roof, or you can also have like a decorative shroud, something to cover up that vent pipe that's just sticking up out of the roof. As they're adding solar panels to roofs, they're going to have to cut down those vents in order to get them in place at times. And for that reason, the code says that you have to leave at least 2 inches. The code says the vent pipe shall terminate not less than 2 inches above the roof surface if it has something going over the top of it. The hope here is that we can provide protection from snow. If a vent gets covered up with a pile of snow, well, then it's useless. But also to be able to provide enough airflow. But hopefully we can hit the middle with these solar panels and accomplish both. 903.1.4 talks about the option to run a vent out the side of a building rather than going up. I've worked in a warehouse where we were installing a new restroom, and the roof was 40 feet up in the air. It made more sense to just go out the sidewall penetration from the first floor. So that's what we did. But here are some provisions for that. You'd want to make sure that you're 10 feet away from the lot line. We don't want our sewer gases getting in the face of our neighbors. Also, it needs to be 10 feet above finished grade outside, so that when we're walking by, we don't have to smell those sewer gases either. The code also requires that these not be underneath a roof that has a soffit. So if there's a soffit that overhangs, we don't want these penetrations right below that, where sewer gases could be drawn up into the attic or into the building. The Utah Amendments requires that you actually stick this out 12 inches from the building for a similar reason. Finally, sidewall vent penetrations also must be protected against birds and rodents and other things getting in, so you have to put some kind of a screen on there so that air can flow through, but that they can't get in and build their nests and block the vents. 903.2 talks about frost closure, and there are places where the temperatures are so cold that the vapors inside of that vent will actually start to collect, freeze, and can block the vent out the roof. This code section refers to this as a place where there's a high percentage, 97.5%, that you're going to be down to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's a lot of locations in North America that would fall into that, right? So if you're in a place that could get that cold, then you have to provide a 3-inch vent through the roof. That means if all that's required for your bathroom group is an 1.5-inch vent, as you're going up through the roof, you would need to open that up larger and run a 3-inch out the roof. Now let me attempt to illustrate this important point, which is that it must change or increase in size 1 foot below the thermal envelope. Well, what's a thermal envelope? The thermal envelope is the insulated space, so your interior space. Let's say you have a room, and then you have the ceiling, and then you have insulation, insulated spaces down below. That's your thermal envelope. So you would need to increase the pipe size below that ceiling before it goes up into the attic, before it goes through all of the insulation, so that you have a wide open pipe in that cold space. 903.3 requires watertight flashings. Sometimes plumbers provide those, sometimes the roofers, but regardless, it has to be sealed up and watertight. 903.4 talks about prohibited use, that the vent terminal shall not be used for any other purpose than a vent terminal. People get creative. Hey, why not? Just hang your TV antenna or your satellite from your vent. That's not what it's for. If it causes damage, that would be a big problem. So vents need to be left alone on the roof. 903.5 gives us more specifics about the location of the vent terminal. States that an open vent terminal from the drainage system shall not be located directly beneath any door, openable window, or other air intake opening of the building. Obviously, we don't want that sewer gas coming back into the building where we have to smell it. And any such vent terminal shall not be within 10 feet horizontally to any of such opening unless it is 3 feet or more above the top of such opening. So keep that number in mind, 10 feet away from any opening, and that includes openings to other buildings of your neighbors or whatever. 903.6 talks about the extension outside a structure. Now, years ago, they used to run vents outside the building. It may come out the roof or out the side of the building and just run up along the side wall. Obviously, that's going to be a problem for freezing. And so, if that is the case, then that vent must be protected against freezing by insulation or heat or both. Not a common practice today. We're running our vents inside the building, but that's how you would handle an exterior vent if it's freezing up. Let's go on to section 904, where we look at the outdoor vent extensions. So anywhere that we're going to run a vent outside, here are the requirements. 904.1 states that the building drain must have one vent that extends outdoors. Whatever drains you have throughout the building, you may have multiple vents that extend out the roof, and hopefully you do, because that vents it well. But if you start using auto vents, or if your systems are small, regardless, you have to have at least one vent that goes from the building drain all the way out to the outdoors. Let's jump back really quickly to our vent definitions from chapter 2. These are two terms that may be confused because they're the same words in a different order. We have this stack vent and the vent stack. Which is which? Well, you need to know because we're just about to talk about the requirements for these. So let's focus in. A stack vent is a vent that comes off of drains at the top of a drainage stack. The key here is to take the first word of these sets and put it first. And that word is going to indicate what is happening. So if it's a stack vent, you have a drainage stack and there's a vent on the top. On the other hand, a vent stack, take the first word, we have a vent. That means this whole thing is a vent. And the vent is a vertical pipe, it is a stack. It does not receive any drainage at all because that entire stack is a vent intended to collect all the other vents. Now, when do you need a vent stack? 904.2 says that vent stacks are required after 5 branch intervals. So 5 or more, is where you would need a vent stack. If you look at the diagram here, we have a series of branch intervals, different floor levels with a variety of plumbing fixtures on each level. As that building gets taller, and once we pass 5 branch intervals, then we would be required to have a vent stack. Okay, I will point out there are only 4 branch intervals here, and you can have a vent stack with less, but the requirement is at 5. Now, what about the vent stack and stack vent terminations? Whatever kind of vent you're dealing with. Code says that those vents shall terminate outdoors in open air, or they give an option for a stack type air admittance valve. We'll look at that in section 918. But once again, if we're trying to provide airflow within a drainage system, the ideal every time is to obtain the air from outside, and that's why there's a requirement for that. All right, let's say that we have a system that is more than 5 branch intervals and we have to install a vent stack. How does that begin? Well, 904.4 states that the vent stack shall connect at the base of the stack, and that connection shall be at or below the lowest horizontal branch. Now, if that connects down below on the building drain, then it has to connect within 10 times the diameter of the drainage stack. They want it close to the stack. So if it's 4-inch building drain and we're going to connect our vent stack at the base at the building drain, it would need to be within 40 inches of the base of that stack. Now, as we look at termination for these vent stacks or stack vents, it says that these shall run together, and they call this a header when you tie all of those together. You can see on the left here we have a vent stack coming up. It ties into the stack vent coming off the top of that drainage stack, and there are vents from that top branch interval that connect into the vent stack. This is where we header them all together, and then they go out the roof and extend to the open air. It then goes on to explain that when you're sizing for these vents, you have to take the sum total of all drainage fixture units connected, and it gives some details about the developed length and how you would size those stacks. We'll look at sizing here in just a bit. The section 905 talks about vent connections and grades, and 905.1 gives us some options for those connections. So as we're running vents for these fixtures, we can run those to a vent stack, a stack vent, an air admittance valve, or we can just run that right out to open air. There's a variety of options here. 905.2 requires that we have slope. Now, interesting that it does not determine the exact grade of the slope. We don't receive any particulars on the percentage grade, but it does have to have grade. And as long as that vent slopes back to a drain, and as long as any condensing moisture within the vent can run down the drain, then that's really all that matters. Here's an interesting example on a diagram. There's a kitchen sink, and we need to run a vent for that, but there's a big beam in the way, so we can't really go through that. You can see here that that kitchen sink vent is actually reverse graded. It flows down and connects into the vent for the bathroom group. As long as that vent connects to a drain, then it doesn't matter which direction that slope goes. Now, this is kind of a rare exception, but it's an acceptable way of running pipes. Even if there's reverse grade, you can do this if it connects to a drain. Let's look at what not to do. Obviously, reverse grade on anything could create a belly, a trap, and that would stop the airflow. So here we have that same kitchen sink scenario where they try to come over, but then thinking, oh, we got to connect at a certain elevation, they've gone under the beam and then come back up to connect to that bathroom group vent and created a trap. That could fill with water, that could block the vent, so that's not an acceptable way to run these pipes. This brings us to 905.3, which talks about vent connection to the drainage system. When it is a dry vent, and it is only intended to allow air into the system, it has to be a vertical pipe. That means it has to come off the top of that drain pipe from the center line within a 45-degree angle. Now, vertical pipes are considered vertical from straight up all the way down to a 45-degree angle. So any of these options here you can see coming off the top or either side, that creates a vertical pipe, and that is an acceptable dry vent option. Now, what is not acceptable is for a dry vent to come off of the side of a drain pipe. We do this in wet venting, But this is not a wet vent. If it is only intended to provide air, then this is not acceptable because it's not vertical. The problem here is that there is a real possibility that that horizontal vent could become blocked. There's never anything to wash it clean, and so scum or whatever else is in the drain could be pushed into there and actually block off the airflow. Here we have another example of an unacceptable connection for a dry vent. We have two toilets in this diagram coming off and a horizontal vent coming straight out from the end of that and up. This is not acceptable because it's horizontal. This toilet vent is coming off of the 90 at a 45-degree angle, so even though that would be kind of an odd thing to try and pipe and get your vent into the wall, it is acceptable. But once again, if it comes off horizontal and is intended to be a dry vent, only providing air to that toilet fixture, this is not an acceptable form of venting. .905.4 gives us more details about the requirement for that vertical rise on a dry vent. And it states that that vent needs to come up 6 inches above the flood level rim of the highest fixture connected before it turns horizontal. So you can't put a 90 and go through studs or whatever until you're above the flood level rim of whatever fixtures are being served. So here we have a floor drain. That pipe comes up. It's in the wall. Once it's 6 inches above the floor, it can turn horizontal. Here's another acceptable option. It could come off on a 45, go and hit a wall, then turn horizontal 6 inches above the flood level rim. Even better though, if we can get our vent below a wall and just come vertically straight off the top of that horizontal drain pipe so that it provides venting for that fixture, that's the ideal. But what does not work for the International Plumbing Code is to have that vent branch off of a horizontal drain below the flood level rim. So we have a floor drain here, and maybe there's no wall nearby. So the idea here is like, well, branch off and send the vent over, but it's below the flood level rim. Now let's examine for a minute why this becomes a problem. Check out this diagram. You have to visualize this in a large building that would have 5 branch intervals or a vent stack, because we have a vent stack and we have a waste stack. And on a certain floor level, here is a mop sink. Now what happens if we branch our vent over from the mop sink drain into the vent stack below the flood level rim? You can see that here. And then there's a blockage. One day something bad goes down the sink and sticks in the drain. Well, as that mop sink continues to be used, that fluid can actually go around that blockage and down into the vent stack. A vent stack is intended entirely for airflow. No drainage is supposed to ever go down a vent stack. But we're diverting that drainage down by this blockage, and at the mop sink, you would never know it. You would never see it overflow or think, oh, there's a problem here, because it just keeps draining, even though it's draining into the vent. So to avoid that issue, here's how we would correct the problem. We see the mop sink and the drain connected over to the waste stack. Our vent for the drain comes off and comes above the mop sink 6 inches above the flood level rim and connects to the vent stack. Now what happens if there's a blockage? Well, the first place you're going to see a problem is at the mop sink. It won't flow. And you'll see that before fluid starts going down into the vent stack and interfering with venting for the rest of the building. This principle is emphasized again in 905.5, where it talks about height above the fixtures. Once again, the vent for any fixture needs to come 6 inches above the flood level rim before it turns horizontal or connects to other things. If you have vents that are connected to different fixtures at different elevations, here we have what appears to be a bathroom group, a toilet, a lav, and a tub. Well, some of those traps are lower, but we go to the highest trap, which would be the sink, and then we say let's add 6 inches above the flood level rim for that fixture. 905.6 talks about vents for future fixtures. Imagine you're in an unfinished basement and you need to provide some pipes for a bathroom group down there, but you know it's not going to get finished at this point. Code requires that you do connect a vent for the drains in that system. The minimum vent size for that is 1/2 the size of the drain, which means you're going to have a toilet there. 1/2 of a 3-inch pipe would be a 1.5-inch vent would be the minimum size for those drains being served. This section also requires that the vent be connected to the vent system or be vented by some other means. So you could do an auto vent down there, but the ideal is to connect it to the vent system. That's going to give it the best airflow. Section 906 is about vent sizing, and we're going to stop this presentation right here because there is a lot to talk about on vent sizing. We'll pick that up on the next presentation. And we're going to conclude this presentation here. We've talked about some of the general requirements for vents. Coming up, we'll go over vent sizing. We'll go over the different types of vents that you can use and the applications of auto vents. So stay tuned. Pick up the other presentations. I'll see you in the next one. We need to do some cool music over this. Show this like Chapter 9.